Dr. Ronald W. Roskens, Administrator of the Agency for International Development, spoke before council members and guests on Thursday, September 26, 1991, at the Hyatt Regency Inner Harbor Hotel. Dr. Roskens' address is entitled The Development Test in a New World Order. Introducing Dr. Roskens is Mrs. Sheila K. Riggs, President of Diversified Health Services Incorporated, and co-chair of the Board of Trustees, the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Sheila Riggs. I've introduced myself now so many times that you probably know that. But I serve as co-chair with Charles W. Cole, Jr. Of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight. Before I go ahead and do that, I want to give special thanks to Johns Hopkins University for sponsoring the reception which we've just enjoyed. And now to the business at hand. President Bush nominated and the Senate confirmed Dr. Ronald W. Roskens as Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, in 1990. As Administrator, Dr. Roskens is the Chief Executive Officer of a $7 billion program of economic and humanitarian assistance to more than 80 developing countries throughout the world. Dr. Roskens' appointment as head of AID follows 30 years of distinguished service in administration, teaching, and research that began when he was a professor at Kent State University and culminated in his appointment as president of the University of Nebraska. He has served as chairman of the American Council on Education, representing more than 3,000 universities and colleges, and as president of the Association of Urban Universities. Dr. Roskens was a trustee of the Harry S. Truman Institute and a member of the board of directors of the Enron Corporation and the Guarantee Mutual Life Company. After serving 5 years as chancellor of the Omaha campus, he was named president of the University of Nebraska, a post which he held for 13 years. Prior to that, he had served for 13 years at Kent State University as a professor and as dean of administration, vice president of administration, and executive vice president. He was born in Spencer, Iowa, and reared on a farm nearby. He holds degrees from the University of Northern Iowa and the University of Iowa, where he earned a PhD in 1958. We are delighted then to have him as our guest this evening, and I'm very pleased to introduce him to you now, Dr. Ronald Roskens.
I very much appreciate your kind and generous introduction, Sheila. I want to make clear that this is water, but this is not. Thus, as we proceed through this conversation together, it ought to get more and more exciting, because I'll not be knowing what it is I am saying, and you'll wonder, what in the world does that mean? I am so inclined, first of all, I'm inclined to get rid of this picture. As an individual, which you just heard, who came from another incarnation just a year and a half or two ago, I'm so inclined when I find myself before a podium to want to say, welcome. University presidents are always doing that. Now, indeed, I will tell you a story about welcome. This is one thing Sheila didn't mention among the several that she didn't, why I don't know. But I was for a time, I'm teasing because I asked her actually to keep it brief, and she did fairly well, wouldn't you say? I mean, she could have gone on and on saying little or nothing about little or nothing. But I was executive assistant to the president in this institution, which was Kent State University. You will remember the days of infamy. Nevertheless, in that capacity, I found myself rather frequently representing the President before bodies such as this, groups that had congregated on the campus for one reason or another, and it was my happy responsibility to represent the President. And the first thing I would say, and this of course is important for you to catch as we go on here, the name of the President was Robert I. White. So invariably I would begin by saying, on behalf of President Robert I. White, I welcome you to the Baltimore Council. No, I would have said Kent State University and the Baltimore Council, and so on. Now what I'm about to tell you, my wife insists is true. I had retired first, as is the custom in our family. It has become that, because I'm an early riser and she's a late riser. There's so many couples like this in the world. I don't quite know why we are unable to get in sync. But nevertheless, I'm in bed. She thinks I'm asleep, as she tells the story, and I probably was. So she tries, when she arrives at the bedside, to steal into bed, carefully, quietly, stealthily, ever so gently moving the covers back, sliding in, pulling the covers up. At which point she says that I rolled over sort of like this and kind of half tapped her on the shoulder, and she said, "What do you want?" And I said, "On behalf of President Robert I. White." Yes, academia. My last, I should say prior refuge. You think about that for a moment. I remember about 6 months before I departed the presidency of the University of Nebraska, a friend of mine, believe it or not, a friend, said to me, "You know, if all the university presidents in the world were laid end to end, it would be a good idea." I have one sister and one brother, both of whom are younger, and I've been somewhat amused and somewhat annoyed at my sister on occasion when I was yet associated with colleges and universities. Because when speaking about us, my brother and I, to others who would perhaps be asking about what it was that we were doing, she would say, "I have 2 brothers, one alive and one on tenure." Perhaps I should tell you something else that Sheila didn't tell you. You really know very little about this individual who stands in your midst and presumes to address you in a minute or two. And it may be helpful to you to know that I am not what is regarded, I think, generally as a very good public speaker. But I think I am improving. And I will give you some evidence. It was approximately 3 months ago that I addressed an audience. After the speech and the questions and the people are beginning to depart, a few individuals, you know, the few who are always very generous and come up to say thank you and so forth. And among them was a lady who, when she reached to be said, "You were much better than the speaker we had 2 weeks ago." And I was trying to say something, but she went right ahead. She said, "You were much better than the speaker we had 2 weeks ago. He spoke for an hour and said nothing, and you did it in 15 minutes. I hope you know that I regard it as a very special privilege to be in your midst, to have in fact been invited to address the Baltimore World Affairs Council. This one of many such councils that is established throughout the United States and with very noble purposes. I find it especially intriguing and gratifying that so many of you in the Baltimore or from the Baltimore area find it possible to assemble at this generally regarded as the dinner hour, though indeed I did observe that you were imbibing, and that may be the draw. I've not thought about that before, but I'm not so sure that it's a draw if you think about it, because you are having to listen to me before you have dinner, wherever the dinner is, unless you ate in advance. I want to think about that a while as to whether that's a sensible approach. But in any event, there are very noble purposes associated with this distinguished group. And I can't imagine a place that I'd rather be, frankly, because it's not so far distant from Washington, D.C., and I mean by that I can get here very easily, to discuss some of the issues in our very rapidly changing world. That in and of itself is rewarding. But it is also, as you know only too well as you heed the information and messages that we're receiving being transmitted almost by the minute. We can't talk about what things were like yesterday. We have to talk about what they were like last hour, as for example in what we have come to call Yugoslavia. We have then as our objective being informed, but being informed about international affairs today is a very elusive topic at best. And yet our nation depends, and especially now, upon an informed citizenry, a citizenry that can, in fact, help us set the course for international relationships that hopefully will be enduring, stabilized, and long-lasting, and will provide for our children and our grandchildren and theirs the kind of a life that the global village, I think, is capable of providing if we're sensible. I feel as though I know several of you already. I'm not going to name names because that's always dangerous. One always finds two or three later who were sitting in the audience that he should have named. But the fact of the matter is there are several people in this organization with whom I'm familiar, some of whom I talked with earlier tonight, and that makes it even more enjoyable to be in your midst. So you're a familiar crowd. You have a familiar set of objectives. I really wish the same could be said in many respects about the world today, that everything in fact, or indeed, were familiar. But we have a world in which fact and fiction seem to have changed roles, if you think about it, where expectations have been exceeded, yes, and disappointments have become fewer and fewer in many respects. The globe is really spinning in overdrive, isn't it? The change is almost too rapid. In fact, I'm going to say to you flatly, the changes that are occurring in our global village are too rapid for us individually to grasp. And I speak for myself when I say that. Contemplate it. We try to picture what is occurring in a given part of the world and yet another country and yet another set of countries, etc. And you can move from Africa all the way through Europe in your mind. And it's exceedingly difficult to comprehend. Consider a land war that involved nearly 1 million combatants, which lasted but 100 hours. Consider a superpower coup that lasted 60 hours. And while we, those of us in the West, look with great relief and even some satisfaction upon these and some other events that we could name, seeing them often as a vindication of American values, which in many respects these items were, seeing them as engagement in the world and the processes which are keeping the world may I say afloat. Yet I confess there is an element to this very fast-paced transformation that is very troubling. A son of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, once said, and I want to quote here, "The public demands certainties, but there are no certainties." Both parts of that observation, I think, are truer now than they perhaps were ever before, at least in our recollection. That's why I fear that change has been so rapid that Americans who are insulated from upset, accustomed to a relatively high degree of certainty, have been unable in many respects to develop a mindset that is willing to accept the consequences of such changes, such dramatic, such cataclysmic changes. In other words, it's critically important. This, I guess, if I am supposed to have a topic for this sermon, this is it. It's critically important that we, you and I, grasp at least minimally what's occurring in the world, because in many cases that's going to require modifying our previously held points of view. Well, what am I talking about? What's an example? Well, it's very difficult today to generate enthusiasm about disliking communists or fearing communists when there aren't very many professing communists left in the world. It's rather difficult to harbor doubts very long about the American military after its nearly flawless performance in the Persian Gulf. And I'm not here to argue the reasoning of that for the moment. It's rather difficult to remember what exactly the Warsaw Pact was, or for that matter, to place your hands literally on an up-to-date map of Europe. The cartographers are going to be multimillionaires. Think about it. It's rather difficult to recall a time when there wasn't a single democratically elected government in Latin America, or when Africa was not swept by democratic reform. Of course, the temporary suspension of belief cuts both ways. It's hard to remember when the nations of the Horn of Africa were able to feed themselves, or when the Western nations believed that malaria was under control in most of Asia, which I regret to say it is not, or when Latin American nations paid debts in full. Last night, we had dinner with the president of Honduras, President Casillas, who is an absolutely superb leader, and we were celebrating the fact that we have just written off debt. Today we had a signing ceremony and made it official, he and I. By the way, just before coming here, since I'm dropping names, love to do that. Don't get a chance very often in Washington, you know. You can't out-drop names in Washington, there's no way. But just so you know that I've been with today, I just came from lunch with King Hassan of Morocco. Now, what does that do for you? I got to tell you, it has nothing to do with what I wanted to talk about. I just thought about it, and I thought I ought to tell you, since Sheila didn't. Are you keeping a track of all of the things you didn't do? You didn't mention another presidency that I had, too, by the way, as I think about it. In fact, I had it twice. 8th grade. Takes a while, doesn't it? You see, friends, when you indulge in drinking those alcoholic beverages, It numbs your thinking processes. Well, we'll try to get back together on more important things. I appreciate the slogan of your organization, a world of education for world citizens. Is that it? Have I got it quite right? It's almost right, isn't it? For today's world citizens, something like that. Because that resonates very much with the idea of what I'm trying to talk about briefly, and that is truly developing individuals, or among us developing ourselves as people who understand, who get a grip on this new world of which we read and hear. A very important frame of reference for the new world is the role of foreign assistance. The trouble is, from my perspective as administrator of the Agency for International Development, I often wonder whether people in the United States particularly appreciate or even understand the links between foreign assistance, the developing world, and the United States economy. Let's not forget something, which I don't think is often enough said, and that is foreign assistance is largely driven by economics. The economic development of the host country, that's the country to which we are, or with which we are associated that I'm referring to, we call them host countries, results in benefits to the United States economy. Indeed, if you remember back to 1947, General Marshall, contemplating the shattered and moribund European continent, said, and I want to quote here, "Aside from the demoralizing effect on the world at large, the consequences to the economy of the U.S. should be apparent to everybody." And that was, you may remember, what motivated the establishment of the Marshall Plan. The motive, if you will, for foreign aid to ensure, back then, America's economic and political well-being would be incorporated in whatever plans were implemented. A Europe that was resuscitated by the Marshall Plan did just that, provided markets for the United States, and not incidentally, a united front against communist expansion and exploitation. In the early 1980s, the Agency for International Development took that idea one step further, concluding at that time that the most effective way to maximize its development effort, wherever it had located itself, was to leverage its energy, leverage its funds through partnerships with the private sector. So since then, the early 80s, this agency has acted as something of a broker to bring outside resources to bear on development issues around the world. And this American engagement in the developing world, I think, has reaped some very enormous benefits. George Bernard Shaw once said that it's the mark of a truly educated person to be deeply moved by statistics. Let me see if I can determine which of you are educated. Prepare yourselves. Of the 50 largest food importers from the United States, countries I'm talking about, 21 were at one time recipients of food aid from this country. Last year, United States exports to developing countries totaled $128 billion. More than half of America's agricultural exports go to the developing world, and each dollar of ag export generates about $2.50 in business through food processing, manufacturing, and transportation. So it's 2.5 times. And of course, you're all witness to the benefits or the effects of contact with the developing world through the port of Baltimore. The transit point here for some 37,000 tons of AID goods in the first 6 months of this year. More than a third of all United States exports are shipped to developing nations, and more than a fourth of all of our overseas investment is in developing nations. By the year 2000, very short distance in time, 4 of every 5 consumers will live in the developing world. Does that not make a very strong case for the economic interrelationships that we are trying to build? Finally, 35 cents of every foreign aid dollar flows to United States businesses and organizations. To build on this story, which I like to think is a success story, we have established a business and development partnership initiative which really seeks actively to engage American business and industry in implementing the objectives that we have in our foreign assistance program in the United States, which is conducted through the Agency for International Development. There are 2 or 3 pillars of this initiative that I want to mention quickly. One is a capital projects fund, which would enable us, if it were funded, to build up some badly needed infrastructure in developing nations and to provide opportunities for U.S. businesses to participate in major sectors. Some years ago, those of you who would remember or would have known of AID, a very large part of the portfolio was in fact capital projects for purposes of developing infrastructure. Egypt is a very good example where there have been literally billions of dollars invested. But in recent years, I'm talking the last decade or so, the amount invested in capital projects has reduced like that to approximately 17% of the total portfolio. A second element in this initiative is building a business development network which we hope will amount to a one-stop shop service in AID that will match United States and developing country entrepreneurs. We think that's going to work. It's very close to being ready. Another aspect is to focus on emerging sectors in development. We want to discover, if we can, the best opportunities for projects in high growth, high margin fields like environmental products, architectural, engineering, financial services, and so on. And then an emphasis on competitiveness. We're going to forge new links among and between American corporations, the Agency for International Development, and U.S. universities and colleges, along with institutions of higher learning in other lands. Another aspect of this initiative swings into action next month when we will convene for the first time an advisory group made up of corporate leaders from around the country, a group that will help us identify how we can move more rapidly. And I want to say parenthetically, that is probably our major deficiency at the Agency for International Development. We are one of the most sluggish, slow-moving, slow-responding institutions in Washington. I would like to tell you that we are going to modify that, and we're going to change it, and it's going to be much different. I can tell you that we have undergone a reorganization about which I'm not going to tell you in detail, but just to point out that the large part of the purpose, or the largest purpose involved in that reorganization, which takes effect October 1, is to see if we can't reduce the amount of time that takes between initial contact of a potential contractor and getting that contract implemented in the field. I could tell you horror stories, well, although I suspect some of you know them. They're unbelievable, the time that has taken. Some people have gone on to other fields of endeavor before the contract got fulfilled. I wouldn't be surprised if some had even died. But we're determined to inject this very critical ingredient into our foreign assistance program, which is American business savvy. And we're going to do that much more forcefully in the developing world than we have before. I think that swelling the streams of commerce with the developing world will be just one feature of what President Bush is calling the New World Order, which he defined, I thought, fairly well before the United Nations in his speech yesterday or the day before. He spoke of an era freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, more secure in the quest for peace, an era in which the nations of the world, east and west, north and south, can prosper and live in harmony. Americans will fail to take advantage of this future renaissance if they become more and more inured to the pivotal change that's occurring at the present time. More than 170 years ago this month, my favorite, if I have to choose one, and I'm willing to do that, Thomas Jefferson, wrote to Mr. Adams, John Adams, as follows: "The flames kindled on the 4th of July, 1776, have spread over too much of the globe to be extinguished by the feeble engines of despotism. On the contrary, they will consume these engines and all who work in them." 'Tis true. Democracy has indeed triumphed over the engines of oppression and cruelty and tyranny. What a tragedy indeed if we were to somehow undervalue this victory, and by doing so allow the opportunities that such undervaluing would present to glide by unnoticed and unused. What a tragedy. What a horrible tragedy if Americans were to neglect the enormous potential for trade and investment in the developing world. What a horrible tragedy if we were to neglect the calls for help, technical assistance that we are receiving almost hourly from countries whose names we did not know, most of us, a year ago. And they're not even established yet as countries. Finally, what a tragedy if we were to fail to solidify all of these victories that have been won. Certainly there's been a great deal, maybe too much, to celebrate in the last 30 months. But after the banners sag and the jubilant crowds go home and the town squares fall silent, that's when the really hard work begins. You know, there are many people in this country, many with whom I've come into contact, some in my own family, who take the view that once dictatorships or communism has been toppled or have been toppled, democracy moved in and took over. Well, you know, democracy doesn't move in and take over. People must learn a great deal. Thus we get requests. We get people begging for for assistance in writing constitutions, in establishing what are property rights. How do we do this, they say? And on and on and on. By hard work, I mean building free market economies. I mean nurturing fledgling democracies, riding out these very severe economic jolts and shocks, such as those that Calles is experiencing in Honduras. I think the Agency for International Development in many respects is on the cutting edge of this very follow-up activity to which I'm referring. And I want to assure you that we're going to try, and try assiduously, not to fail these nations, these 80-plus nations with which we're associated. Nations that in many respects are struggling to stand on their own 2 feet, and that's our purpose, to help them do that. We must not allow these nations to buckle and fall, lest we find ourselves in the global village back where we were. We've reached a day for which many Americans have hoped and worked and sacrificed. For all intents and purposes in the world, communism is dead. Dictatorships are dying. Statism has proven obsolete. And democracy and free markets just excite people around the world. So it's a world that's befitting and benefiting this international city of Baltimore and this council. It's a world in which you can promote a world education for today's world citizen and feel good about it, and then spread the word. And the word is this: Americans should exult in a world largely fashioned by American power and American ideals, and with an informed, confident worldview. Americans will thrive in this world, which I like to call the global village, a world that they have helped shape in very large, if not irrevocable ways. Thank you.
As a world citizen, I certainly appreciate the efforts of AID to further worldwide democracy and endorse those activities. However, as a business person, I have big problems with some of the AID's historical focus, at least in the last 10 years. You mentioned that 35% of the AID budget ends back in the U.S. With American business or services. That may be higher now than it actually was a few years ago. You also mentioned, for example, a celebration of forgiveness of debt to Honduras. That's, again, a noble objective, but this month I learned that I had lost a multi-million-dollar contract in Honduras to a Dutch contractor, a Dutch manufacturer. My company makes construction equipment, which was financed by the Dutch AID, which we had no chance to match. We have had similar stories in the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Yugoslavia, Indonesia. The list goes on to companies from Germany, France, Britain, etc. And so we are off pursuing our noble objectives, which certainly cannot be criticized from the perspective that you described it. How do we get back at that business in the developing world, which we are losing because other countries have different criteria and different objectives from our own?
Okay. It is a very real dilemma, and it is one with which we are very familiar. Let me define a bit what has been going on, just to add to your point, which is wholly legitimate. Many of the countries to which you referred, or to which you are alluding, at least in general, I don't think you mentioned Japan, did you? But Japan is another example, have been using the tide aid approach, which means simply yes, we will provide $250 million for this project, but you must buy your whatever equipment or what's the word I want? Services from us, meaning in this case Japan or any of these other countries. That's what the word tied aid means in the event that you hadn't known that. The United States has avoided, basically the United States Congress has avoided that, insisted that we avoid it. We are now coming to grips with that. This is in part why I mentioned this initiative, which is bringing business and industrial people in with us, and we are seeing changes in the congressional mood, part of which it results, I might add, from the changes in the world about which I've been talking. But I think I can say to you in all candor, that scene is going to change. We have, for example, a very strong Buy America theme throughout all that we do. If there are items to be purchased, for example, in one of the Central American countries a year and a half or so ago, it was time to buy new trucks. I think they were pickup trucks. And there was on the front page of a publication, it may have been a newspaper, I don't recall, it's not ours, a picture with the United States ambassador, and there may have been one or two of our people there, it doesn't matter, I don't recall. But pointing out these new, I think it was 20-some pickup trucks, which were Toyotas. That newspaper went through the Congress as fast as any rumor that you've ever heard about. And of course it was called to our attention because our funds were used. I point this out simply to say there's a very strong sense that we've got to get out of that frame of reference. Now on the other side, let me add, the major donor nations, the bilateral donors, like Japan, Britain, Germany, so forth, have counterparts to me, and we meet fairly frequently. We have been pressing the Germans and the Japanese in particular, though not exclusively, to either stop doing what they're doing, the way they're doing it, or be prepared for the United States to use the same ploy. So we're on that wavelength, I think.
Yes, sir. I'm going to go out on a limb and make the assumption that you get more requests for money than you have money to give out. I assume that's a really safe.
That's a limb you're safe on.
Thank you. I wonder if you could comment on how you go about prioritizing your requests. That is, how do you decide how big a slice of the pie to give to whom, and how much of that is driven by politics or governmental influence, as well as from what you said earlier about economic factors? What is the objective prioritizing way you do that?
First, let me say that a very large percentage of our funds are locked in because of congressional earmarking. Sometimes it's earmarking for specific projects, as for example tomorrow I'm going up to the Hill to participate in a signing ceremony for $5 million to go to Vietnamese people who've lost their limbs. This is to provide some people in that country to help them learn how to make artificial limbs. That's just an example, a small one. We have a lot of that. We have had a lot of that. We have, however, to be fair, been able to persuade the Congress in the bill that is now being debated, now being considered by committee. It's passed in both houses, but it's different. So we have conference committees. We have been able to persuade the Congress, both House and Senate, to reduce the number of earmarks. So what I'm telling you really is about the past. If this bill passes and isn't vetoed, which I think is unlikely, the latter is unlikely, then we'll have to start over again. But nevertheless, they did reduce the number of the earmarks. That's one part. With respect to establishing priorities for those funds over which we have some considerable freedom, we have three basic funds, the development assistance funds, the economic support funds, and the development fund for Africa. Africa is the only continent for which there is separate funding, which was done by the Congress about 5 years ago, and it's now up to, in this bill of which I'm speaking, from $650 million when I came into office in 1990, and the budget then was $650, it is now being proposed at $1 billion. That's just to give you an example that there's growth in other parts of the world than in the more glamorous Eastern world and so forth. But establishing priorities is done largely this way. So much money or so many dollars are available for each of the sectors of the world. We call them bureaus, geographic bureaus, Asia, Europe, ta-da. Some of it's been earmarked, but what hasn't been earmarked is dealt with by individuals in terms of establishing priorities, country by country, which we have done too little of in the past. Moreover, we are now putting into place something that I found appalling when I arrived. I might as well be candid about it. There was little or no evaluation in place. We were successful. We deemed ourselves to be successful if at the end of a fiscal year, which is upon us now in terms of this one, September 30, if at the end of a fiscal year, the $162 million that was designated for Guatemala had been invested, we were successful. Nobody was looking at what the outcomes were. We can't do this all overnight, but that's something we must do, and we're in that. I've kind of gotten off, I think, some of your questions. What have I missed?
Well, the part about how do you determine how much money goes to which country and which projects and which...
It's done in the same way, I think, that businesses and corporations go about the business of determining how much should go into R&D, how much for this product, how much for that, and so forth. Looking at each country very, very carefully and determining, are the health needs greater than, let us say, infrastructure for business and development? I'm just using those two quick examples. And then in each bureau, they have to look at each country. And we're going to reduce the number of projects, I might add. This is you didn't
The other
answer.
part behind that I'd ask was, is there a political agenda?
Oh,
That is, do you attempt
of
to
course.
give more money to certain countries to achieve certain social goals?
Let me add, when I mentioned the three categories of fundings, I meant to say that ESF, the Economic Support Funds, are largely used to satisfy the expectations of the President and the Secretary of State, and the Congress to some extent. But they are largely political. Well, for example, what country leader was here? President Diouf was here from Senegal a couple of weeks ago. And the president, in his conversation with him, wanted to encourage him in terms of their economic support. I'm saying that wrongly. Their economic readjustment program. And he also wanted to give some, I think he didn't say this out loud, but I'm quite sure it was there. He wanted to make clear to the Senegalese that we very much appreciated their encouragement and support. They were the first African nation right out front in the recent war. So they were given an additional $28 million economic support fund. So political, call it friendship. You could attach words depending upon how cynical you are or aren't. It's there.
Thank you. Yes, again at that microphone.
One of the concepts that has changed, of course, in recent months and years has been thinking of the developing world, not necessarily to include Russia, but now seeing economic circumstances as they are, maybe it begins to qualify for needing economic aid as a developing country. Where do you understand that there will be criteria for deciding whether to give aid? What are we looking for when we can safely give it until we account for? And then as you ended up saying you think the American role is ever so important in the whole world, to what degree does this economic development perhaps need to be tied to a concept of the federal system under which our states are combined in forming our own United States, and indeed many federal suggestions. How do you figure that comes into the economic thing too?
Let me start with that by saying that we make a fairly strong point of not attempting to graft the United States political system onto any country. That does not say, however, that we are not, with our presence, our people, not just AID people, people who are in the embassies and so on, trying to point out the benefits of such arrangements, particularly to an area of the world which used to be called the USSR, and that's passé now. The point is, I think the point that you're making is that there are some benefits to be achieved by having some sort of confederation, some sort of federal relationship. Now, would we condition funds directly on that point? Probably not, but more than likely we wouldn't even be thinking about funds until they were at a point at which it was clear that either they are going to be a federation or a loose confederation, I mean a tight federation or a loose confederation or whatever. Now, with respect to the Soviet Union, let me call it Soviet Union because it's an easy way to define it, even though it isn't that anymore. With respect to the provision of some assistance there, at present we are prohibited by law and by a presidential edict from doing anything other than the provision of some technical assistance, which could very well be, God forbid, lawyers going to help them write constitutions. I mean, this constitutional law is a very big need in these countries, and that's one of the things they've asked for. They also need technicians in terms of developing market economies, etc. And when I say technicians, I'm talking about people who are walking right beside them on the ground, not intellectual. Please don't mistake this, but not intellectual people who are teaching courses in the university. That's not what we're talking about. So we will be doing that. And the second thing that we're able to do is to provide food aid. There is a grave misconception about food shortages in the Soviet Union. You've heard and read, and some of you may have heard what is really true, but many people haven't. There is not a food shortage in the context of amount of food available. There is a shortage only in the sense that the producers, when prices began going up about 5 months ago, began to hoard it and not allow it onto the market. At the same time, the housewives, sensing that prices were going up, began to hoard it on their end. We find that what we have to do to try to be helpful is to teach the Soviets how to get people back together. Do you understand what I'm saying? Thank you.
Yes, sir. I want to follow on somewhat an earlier questioner. He mentioned the fact that you were celebrating the cancellation of the debt with Honduras, and I've yet to hear from you what great accomplishment was produced by that aid. But I want to ask you an even more cynical question that is more generic in nature. I come, like you, from the heartland of America, where in 1950 we had a senator from Ohio, my native state, Robert Taft, who used to ask some very cynical questions about foreign aid. And I suspect, sir, and I think this needs to get the attention of you and the President, that there are lots of Americans around the country who have not heard, and you said you were appalled by the fact that up till now we've not looked at the outcome of foreign aid. That's a terrible indictment of the agency that you represent. You said you were appalled by your predecessor failing to do that. And in that context, when the American people are looking around at the neglected problems in this country, and they're going to be hearing about that in the Midwest and the East, isn't it absurd for someone without a long record of accomplishment to talk about $7 billion, which you administer, with a program that has not produced any dramatic results, and certainly if they have, they've been the best kept secret in the land? I'd like you to address as honestly as you can that cynical Midwestern question.
Well, sir, may I say, first of all, I certainly understand the cynicism, but I must say that you asked far more than one question.
Well, answer
Let me make an effort. I don't know that I can satisfy you. You are obviously quite moved by the point of view that you hold, and I respect that. Let me say this. When I talked about celebrating, first of all, I did not want to give the impression that I nor those who were there were necessarily in a celebratory mood. I'm merely pointing out to you factually, which I think is my obligation, that that is one of the means being employed today by the United States government, and I'm talking about Congress as well as the administration, to help countries that have not yet gotten on their feet to do so, because they're obviously unable to repay their debt. We could argue that for 40 days and 40 nights and not get anywhere, probably. More importantly, you say we haven't accomplished anything, if I understood you correctly, that you know of little or nothing that has been accomplished by the Agency for Internet.
I asked you to point out some dramatic changes that have taken place
Yeah.
with all of the billions of dollars that we have.
Well, let me just give you a few. I'm not going to stand here and recite all night for you, but I'll be glad to send you some materials that would perhaps give you some better detail than I have at the tip of my tongue. But let me give you some. The death rate from diphtheria and measles has reduced remarkably in the world, particularly in those parts of the world where we have been providing inoculations. We're now at a point at which we can look toward the objective of 95% of the children of the world having been inoculated for measles by the year 1995. That was done by AID. Family planning, a subject that is sensitive, to be sure, but I will tell you bluntly what many people say about me, somewhat jokingly, but it's true. We are the largest provider of condoms in the world. We have reduced, in several countries, we have reduced the population growth from as high as 8%, which means that a population will double and triple within 10, 12 years, to below 2.5%, which is regarded as maximum. In Thailand, for example, we did that. That's an example. In Egypt, where I have been only once since I've been in this office, there are evidences, I think, of poor management in terms of getting some of the projects implemented. But if you've been to Cairo, you know this. There is now clean water. There's a sewage program that's not what I should call it. I've forgotten the word that I want, but nevertheless, a system that eliminates waste, thank you. Waste disposal is what I'm trying to say. We did that. In Morocco, they were having really almost starvation problems. Back 10 years ago, 2 or 3 universities went there to help them learn, one, about raising sorghum on dry land, and their land, when we talk about dry land in that country, it's terribly dry. If you know that country, you know that to be the case. And also a variety of wheat that was resistant to a disease that had killed wheat for years, decades. We did that. Those are some examples.